thank the organizers of the meeting for doing all the great work necessary to bring this fantastic meeting to fruition and for inviting me to participate. I'm going to be talking now in the clinical domain, in contrast to most of yesterday. And I'm going to be talking about insomnia medications. I'm going to be addressing the question of, does their mechanism of action matter? And I'm going to argue that it does. These are my disclosures. So an overview of what I'm going to say is that I'm going to first introduce the fact that people have long believed that the medication mechanism of action doesn't make any difference. Doesn't matter whether you're a benzodiazepine or a different class of medication. And everybody assumed that the properties were essentially those of the benzodiazepines, that everything's mechanism of action was like those. And I'm going to present the evidence that counters that suggests that is not the case, with several examples that have emerged relatively recently, and then I'm going to try and pull it together with proposing a more appropriate model. So the benzodiazepines and related medications have really long dominated the treatment of insomnia. I'm talking about until the last 10 to 15 years, where other agents of other types have been available. But for the 30 years before that, it really was all benzodiazepines. It's not that they were the only drugs used, but they were the only drugs where we had rigorous studies carried out to tell us what their properties were. And their effects really became the model for how we think about medications. If that's all you know, it's natural to assume that. And there were no counterexamples to suggest that a different mechanism of action existed that was relevant. The relatively recent data, and it's not really that recent now, but it is in the big picture sense relatively recently, are on agents that are relatively specific antagonists of wake-promoting systems. And the data with those contradicts the model that the mechanism of action doesn't matter and that they're like benzodiazepines. And that's good, because it suggests the possibility that we can tailor treatment by having properties that differ. And these are relatively selective. They block, let's say, a single wake-promoting system, so they don't have the broad kind of inhibitory effects that benzodiazepines do, and therefore you could, by using one of them in the right context, have a better risk-benefit ratio. But they present a problem. What is the right model? And that's what I'm going to try and talk about. So first, let's review these medications. First, I have to address a pet peeve. People refer to these often as benzodiazepine receptor agonists. There is no such thing as a benzodiazepine receptor agonist because there's no such thing as a benzodiazepine receptor. These drugs bind to a peptide on the GABA-A receptor, and it is an ion channel through which chloride flows down its concentration gradient, higher concentration outside from inside. And when benzodiazepines bind to this peptide, it changes the conformation of the channel, enhances the opening that happens when GABA binds. So you get greater flow of chloride inside, makes the inside more negative than the outside. Classic hyperpolarization inhibition model. So it enhances inhibition. And they don't do anything if there's no GABA. So it can't it's not a receptor for benzodiazepines. Okay, I got that out of the way. These are famous drugs like Halcyon and Dalmane and Restoril. Now, the related drugs, they're not related chemically, which is why it's okay to call them non-benzodiazepines, which is really used for marketing purposes, but it's true. These are drugs like Ambien and Lunesta and Sonata, and they don't share the common chemical structure that benzodiazepines share, so they're different. But they have the same mechanism of action. And some argue, well, isn't it different? Well, the benzodiazepines are different within themselves, as are these drugs different from the benzodiazepines and from each other. It really is. But they share that they're all positive allosteric modulators of GABA-A. So now I want to summarize a huge amount of data as concisely as possible for the purposes of this talk. And that is, I'm going to do this in the format of a table that really asks the question, do these medications have the effects that we're interested in clinically and that might be relevant to understanding how they work? And so I'm going to review a set of these, and it's obviously a qualitative thing summarizing a huge amount of data. But Yes, they do have sleep onset effects if they're dosed at the appropriate time, if given at the beginning of the night in appropriate dosage. They do decrease wake time after sleep onset. They decrease the time you wake in the middle of the night. They decrease awakenings. They can affect your sleep at the end of the night, early morning wake time. But if they do, there's a price. Really only one really good example of this is flurazepam, Dalmane. And it does help sleep at the end of the night. But if it does, it not only sedates you in the morning, it sedates your grandchildren. It is a very long-acting drug, and I don't know why anybody thought it made sense to use for sleep. But it also is clear if you dose the drug during the daytime, it has therapeutic effects, therapeutic from the point of view of enhancing sleep. There are actually negative effects if you're trying to stay awake, and that's sometimes a problem. They are helpful in people who are under stress, who have depression, who have anxiety, who also have insomnia. And they clearly increase the arousal threshold, and they have psychomotor impairment. They have relatively broad inhibitory effects in the central nervous system. So it's clear sedation can occur pretty much at any time. It's relatively independent of time of day. That's not exactly true, but it's largely true, and other related factors like if you're under stress. And the model that emerged is that sleep-enhancing effects are essentially proportional to blood level of drug. That, stated another way, the pharmacodynamics are proportional or determined by the pharmacokinetics. And you really can't do much tailoring with these drugs. You can say, well, I have a person who has a sleep onset only problem. I'll give a short half-life one at a relatively low dose, and then you have effects on at the beginning of the night, not later on. If you need to help sleep maintenance, you use a longer half-life drug, higher dose, that kind of thing. Counterexamples to that model that the drug effects are driven by blood level, and that's really the whole story. And I'm going to review several types of medications to make that case. First, H1 receptor antagonists. These are histamine antagonists, sometimes referred to as antihistamines. They block the wake-promoting effect of histamine. So you're probably thinking what I thought when I first started studying these. Really? Antihistamines? There's a new story there. Isn't that what Noah used to sedate the animals with insomnia on the ark? I mean, these are drugs that have been around longer than benzodiazepines, right? These are really old drugs. We have tons of experience with them in all kinds of settings. But the problem is, none of the ones that we studied and used were selective for H1 antagonism, so we really never learned what that mechanism does itself. And it was clouded by the other effects that these drugs have. Diphenhydramine has significant anticholinergic effects. Drugs that we think of, like amitriptyline and trazodone, actually have this histamine antagonism as maybe second or third most potent effect, and so their dominant effects are other things. It turns out by quirk that the story has actually only been unfolding in the context of medications we call antidepressants. They are drugs that happen to have been initially developed and approved for treatment of depression, but they are more potent and selective than anything we call an antihistamine. If anything deserves to be called an antihistamine, it's these drugs. But it's just the accident of how they were developed. So doxepin, for example, in dosages of 75 to 150 milligrams, has serotonin reuptake inhibition and all kinds of good things if you want an antidepressant. But because its potency is so high for H1 antagonism, in theory there's a dose low enough where you can get only H1 antagonism clinical effects, and that happens in the range of 1 to 6 milligrams, way lower, at which it's a range that's actually FDA approved now for treatment of insomnia. And mirtazapine, a similar story in the 1 to 3 milligram range. So what are the clinical effects? They're very different than what you see with benzodiazepines. The sleep, no matter when you dose it, the sleep onset effects are relatively modest compared to their ability to help people return to sleep. That is, they are very potent at decreasing wake time after sleep onset, but they don't decrease number of awakenings, remarkably. That is not true of benzodiazepines. If you do one, you do the other. What they do is they help people get back to sleep faster. They take long awakenings and make them short awakenings. That's how the awakenings stay the same. A remarkable observation that led me down this path was when the first data came out in phase 2 of doxepin in very low dosage. I saw the fact that they had effects in the early morning, at the end of the night, which That's okay. That can happen. I thought, okay, this is a long half-life drug. It's got a half-life of like 11, 12 hours. That's not unusual. If this were a sleep drug, that's what you'd expect. What blew me away was that there was no impairment in the half hour after that when people were tested once they were awake. That can't happen with the benzodiazepine. Biggest effect, and in fact, it was their biggest effect in hour 8 of an 8-hour night. With the benzodiazepine, you have your biggest effect in hour 8. You're going to have your next biggest effect in hour 9 because blood levels are gradually diminishing and therapeutic effects or adverse effects. All effects are largely proportional to blood level. So there was something different going on here. The other thing was biggest effect in hour 8, peak blood level happens at hour 3. What is going on? So we'll get to that in a second. The other thing that was notable about them is that they don't increase the arousal threshold. They don't have psychomotor impairment. So if you are asleep and there's a disturbance or something that wakes you up, this doesn't stop you from doing it. The auditory arousal threshold is not elevated by doxepin. Strange. So unique properties. Let's just quickly review a little bit of this data in the limited time we have. So here we have awake time in every hour of the night, a way that a slice of the pie we only were motivated to look at when we started seeing weird things like this. And higher means you're more awake, so that what you're looking for in a therapeutic effect is the silver gray bar being higher than the green bars. That means you've got a big effect. Well, look at hour 3 and 4. The effects there are not that big. The biggest effect, the biggest difference is hours in 7 and 8. In hours in 7 and 8, I would say what we're seeing is that histamine is waking people up because blocking histamine and doing nothing else keeps those people asleep and creates the other people asleep and creates this big difference. So the biggest effects are there in hour in 7 and 8, but these are the standard tests done for impairment. And this was done in some studies a half hour, in some studies an hour after waking people up, and there was absolutely no effect, no statistically significant effects on the sleepiness ratings, on performance in the digit symbol substitution test and symbol copying test. This caught my eye and really started me down this road. In contrast, here's a benzodiazepine. It's behaving nicely. It's playing well with us as we expected, and that is its peak blood level happens about in hour 1-ish, and you see big differences here. You got a big silver bar there, and the gold bar is way smaller in hour 1 and 2 and 3, and then as time goes on, the effect goes away. You don't see that difference anymore. That's what you'd hope. If this was flurazepam, you would see effects throughout the whole night, but you'd still see the biggest effects around peak blood level, unless you saturated with some monstrous dose, but that wouldn't be practical. So this is what you want this drug to do. You want to get off. You don't want to be sedating people in the morning, and it means you can't treat people who have problems in hours 7 and 8 of the night, or even 6, without consequence. That seems to be an interesting opportunity here with the selective H1 antagonists. Now I'm going to move to the hypocretin orexin receptor antagonists, which we heard about hypocretin orexin. It's important yesterday, and probably we've all heard about it many times. It's one of the most important wake-promoting neurotransmitters, and yet it has been only relatively recently studied as in terms of its drugs that block it, and its properties turn out to be a lot like the properties of histamine antagonists. If you look at them, that is, while they have a bigger sleep onset effect, it's still less prominent than their effect on wake after sleep onset. Notably, like histamine antagonists, selective histamine antagonists, they don't decrease awakenings. They take long wake times and make them short wake times. They get you back to sleep faster. They also can have effects, among their largest effects, in the 7th and 8th hours of the night, but they have broader effects through the night. But if they do, you do not pay the kind of price you do with a benzodiazepine. There's minimal sedation the next day. And they also don't have an increase in the arousal threshold or significant psychomotor impairment associated with them. This is just showing you hour-by-hour data with a orexin antagonist, hypocretin orexin antagonist, suvorexin, and you can see lower means you've improved more from baseline, and you can see that there's effects throughout the night, including in hours in 7 and 8, which perhaps are among, if not the biggest effects. All right, moving on to the last example, selective serotonin type 2A receptor antagonism. We have relatively less data with this, but we have clear polysomnographic findings that tell an interesting story. These drugs block the wake-promoting effects of serotonin at the 2A receptor. Serotonin has other effects on sleep at other receptors that are not of relevance here. These drugs have very unusual effects. And we've known about this for a while. It just hasn't made its way into the world because there aren't any FDA-approved ones of these. They bombed out because of adverse effects issues or other issues, not having big enough self-report effects, but robust polysomnographic effects. They don't have any effect on sleep onset. They, unlike the other two drugs I talked about, don't have as big effects on wake time as they do on awakenings. They prevent awakenings. They do decrease wake time, but that's largely because they're cutting out awakenings. So it's the reverse. They don't sedate anybody in the morning. No matter what time of day you take it, you can take it. And it was interesting. We were planning a trial of one of these, and the phase 1 data that we use as a basis for planning the studies was morning dosing. And there was no impairment all day long, and yet people had decreased awakenings at nighttime, as long as the blood level was high enough, given the half-life, to get clinically relevant blood levels overnight. And we debated this. We decided not to dose it in the morning because it was, even though we thought, well, that's convenient for people, it's counterintuitive, and if there turned out to be some adverse effects during the day, there would be legal liabilities to worry about. It has no effect on arousal threshold or psychomotor function. So I want to synthesize with limited time, so I could only do a massively condensed review of a very complex set of literature, so take that into account. But there's clear evidence that unlike the GABA positive allosteric modulators, there are medications that have clinical effects that are not proportional to the blood level. They have their biggest effects at times other than their peak blood level. You can have a big effect in hour 8 and nothing in hour 9, a step function. You just can't do that with a benzodiazepine. You can have very specific effects, like an effect on wake time after sleep onset, but not awakenings, or awakenings but not so much wake time after sleep onset. These effects are relatively circumscribed in that sense, which is good because the circumscribed effects mean we could have, unlike GABA positive allosteric modulation, which has relatively broad effects on brain systems and therefore adverse effects associated with this, you can selectively block something like histamine, and the side effects associated with that are relatively minimal. We did a study in older adults with insomnia. We improved their wake time after sleep onset significantly, and it was the only study I've ever done where the placebo side effects were more than the drug side effects. It's remarkable. So the selectivity can get you something. What you get is a better risk-benefit ratio, capacity to tailor treatment. But it creates a problem. What's our model of how insomnia agents work if it's not peak blood level, should be, blood level determines the outcome? Well, I'm going to propose something now in the last 2 minutes I have here. And some of this is speculative, but it tries to pull together the observations into some kind of story. First, key thoughts that I think have to be considered. One is, if you're thinking about blocking a wake-promoting system, then you have to take into account that there are more than one, and they function in parallel, and that you could, if you only need one to be active, so in order to keep people awake. So let's suppose you blocked histamine, but then there is an effect of norepinephrine. Well, it's not going to matter that you blocked histamine. You're still going to be awake, right? And the other sort of a corollary of this is the idea that sleep enhancement is really only going to be possible when the system that you block is active and the other parallel wake-promoting systems are relatively less active, less important. First, on the active side, you can only block an effect if there's an effect. If there's no activity, there's nothing you're not going to change anything in anybody. So there has to be activation. And I would argue that, let's say at the end of the night, histamine release is clearly pretty high because you block, if you don't block it, you get a bunch of awakening. If you block it, the awakenings go away. It must mean that there's nothing else keeping you awake at that time of night. And so the second part of that point is that blocking a system only matters if another wake-promoting system is not maintaining wakefulness. The other thing that's a key observation is that the jobs that these wake-promoting neurotransmitter systems do are complicated. Some of them are driven on circadian cycles, and some of them are, like norepinephrine, is turned on by novelty and stress and other things. And so there is some specificity related to that. So histamine neurons look like they tend to be activated at the end of the night and the morning, and they don't play a role in awakenings. Otherwise, blocking them would decrease awakenings, but it doesn't. Hypocretin orexin antagonists very similarly, and the serotonergic 2A receptor antagonists suggest that these serotonin 2A neurons appear to play a role primarily in awakening people at night. So some serotonin activation must occur while people are asleep for some reasons in some settings, and that is mediated, at least in part, by serotonin antagonism. And lastly, whether a wake-promoting system is predominant depends on the pattern of activity in these systems. This is sort of a summary of these points in the system you're blocking versus the parallel wake-promoting systems. And that is going to be affected by two things that haven't been considered before: circadian rhythm. So, right, what time of day are you looking at, and what systems tend to be active and inactive based on the clock and behavioral context? That's more theoretical. There is some support for it. Like norepinephrine is activated by novelty. Hypocretin-orexin neurons are activated by anticipation of reward. If you have something exciting you, you could stay awake because you have hypocretin-orexin antagonism, hypocretin-orexin activating, even if you block histamine. So fine, what is the model I propose? And I'll wrap up because you all heard the bell. The new model I would propose is that we had part of it, that still applies, and that is blood level still matters. You have to have a sufficient blood level. But we would only expect sleep-enhancing effects when a blood level is sufficient and the blood thing you're affecting, you're mitigating it either with a sleep-promoting or a blocking awake-promoting system, that what you're mitigating is relatively active at the time you're interested in, and all other parallel wake-promoting systems are relatively less important. And this may depend on circadian rhythm and context, two factors we have not considered before. So I just want to end by taking the doxepin example. So probably what's happening is doxepin and hypocretin-orexin are both the most important activities at the end of the night. Relatively quiescence is the state of most of the other systems. So you block those and you get a beneficial effect. But after the alarm clock goes off, clearly other systems kick in and keep you awake, like norepinephrine. You may get an increase in release of histamine and hypocretin-orexin that counteract the blockade based on clock and based on behavioral factors. And that can account for the fact that the model of blood level is all we need to worry about isn't right, and we need to take into account these other factors. I'll stop there and see if you have questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for that whirlwind tour. You have 2 minutes for questions.
Combining them, are their effects just additive? If you have two that have different mechanisms and different effects, can you just put more checks in your boxes, or do
Yes.
they do something?
Absolutely. Now, there are sometimes pharmacologic reasons that you can't, like interactions at the level of metabolism and things like that. But people are doing this. I'm doing this. I don't know. Actually, I shouldn't say people. Like I give a medication that has a sleep onset effect, like a benzodiazepine. There are actually our most potent sleep onset drugs, but a very short acting one, and then give somebody a drug to help at the end of the night if they happen to have both of those problems, like doxepin. And I do that clinically when needed to improve risk benefit. It's way better than giving a person who has sleep onset problems and problems at the end of the night flurazepam.
The very nice perspective, I saw.
Thank you.
Really well done.
Thanks.
And there's one thing that I was thinking a little bit more. It's true that, for example, orexin hypocretin, when you give it, it looks like when you give it in the evening, as you said, it kind of removes this wake-promoting zone.
Yeah.
That's Jamie Sizer and
Yeah.
has been doing some experiments there. And I was thinking that there's another factor that maybe could be added in your model, but is the reactivity depending on the sleep debt amount that you have. So, for example, orexin hypocretin increases with sleep deprivation. And the absence of orexin, I think, explain why, in my opinion, narcoleptics cannot stay a long period of time awake, because as soon as they have a sleep deprivation, they should raise their orexin hypocretin to fight it, and they can't do that because they don't have this system. So I'm wondering if also in this model we should not think of how these drugs interact with sleep deprivation debt.
It's been bothering me that I have left out one of the two factors of the two-factor model, and I wasn't aware of that. I'd love to write a paper with you about that to try and pull that in, because I felt like a missing piece, but I wasn't aware of that data, so I appreciate you bringing it up. I think it makes a lot of sense.